Most people in the bank barely looked at the older man when he walked in. His coat was worn, his steps were slow, and the way he paused near the front desk made a few employees assume he was confused, maybe even lost. But the truth was, he wasn't there by accident, and he certainly wasn't someone to dismiss. Within minutes, the manager came out, spoke to him with sudden respect, and personally escorted him upstairs. What happened next didn't just change the mood in the building. It exposed how quickly people judge someone based on age, appearance, and silence. And by the time the full reason for his visit became clear, everyone watching wished they had seen him differently from the start. The lobby was busy in the way banks always are, quiet, tense, and full of people pretending not to listen while hearing everything around them. A young teller glanced up from her screen, gave the older man a polite but distracted smile, then quickly looked past him as if someone more important might be next in line. Near the waiting area, a security guard shifted his weight and watched him for a second too long, already deciding he might need help filling out a form or finding the exit. The old man said nothing. He simply held a small envelope in one hand and rested the other on the polished counter, patient, steady, almost as if he had all the time in the world. That calm seemed to make the employees even more certain of their judgment. One clerk leaned toward another and whispered something with a faint smirk. Another pointed subtly toward the chairs, ready to guide him away from the front desk before he could slow things down. Then the receptionist asked, in the careful tone people use when they think someone might be confused, whether he was looking for personal banking, customer service, or just a place to sit for a moment. A few people nearby glanced over. The assumption was obvious now. They didn't see a man with purpose. They saw someone old, quiet, and out of place. But the older man didn't react with embarrassment or anger. He only lifted his eyes, gave a small nod, and mentioned a name so softly that the receptionist almost asked him to repeat it. Then her expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough to make the room feel different. She picked up the phone at once, and less than a minute later, the manager stepped out of his office. The manager didn't rush, but the moment he appeared, the energy in the lobby shifted. His posture straightened, his expression sharpened, and the casual rhythm behind the counters seemed to falter all at once. A second earlier, the older man had been treated like an inconvenience. Now the branch manager was walking directly toward him, with the kind of focus usually reserved for high-value clients and private appointments. "Sir," he said, extending his hand before anyone else could speak, "I'm glad you came in." The words were simple, but they landed heavily. The receptionist lowered her eyes. The teller, who had barely acknowledged the man, suddenly looked busy with papers that didn't need sorting. Even the security guard stepped back, as if trying to erase the fact that he had been studying the old man like a problem waiting to happen. The older man accepted the handshake without a hint of triumph, no smile of satisfaction, no effort to embarrass anyone. He just nodded once, calm as ever, while the manager spoke to him in a low, respectful tone no one else could quite hear. Then, without hesitation, the manager gestured toward the private staircase leading upstairs, not toward customer service, not toward the waiting chairs. Upstairs. That was the moment everyone in the lobby realized the same thing at once. They had made a mistake. A quiet one, maybe, but the kind that reveals more about the people making it then the person receiving it. And as the older man followed the manager past the polished doors, every set of eyes in the room stayed fixed on him, because suddenly he was no longer invisible. Upstairs, the noise of the lobby disappeared almost completely. The second floor felt different, quieter, softer, built for conversations that never happened in public. Framed certificates lined the walls, old photographs hung in careful rows, and behind a glass door sat the manager's private office, polished and still. The older man stepped inside without hesitation, as if this part of the bank was no stranger to him. The manager pulled out a chair personally and asked whether he would like coffee or tea. It was a small gesture, but one no one downstairs would have imagined only minutes earlier. The old man thanked him, placed the envelope on the desk, and waited. He didn't look around in awe. He didn't ask nervous questions. He simply sat there with the ease of someone who had come for a reason and had no need to explain himself too quickly. Then the manager opened the envelope, and his expression changed again, this time more carefully. He looked from the paper to the man, then back to the paper, as though confirming something he had only heard about before. "I had a feeling," he said quietly, almost to himself, "but I didn't want to assume." The older man gave a faint smile. "Most people already did," he replied. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The office seemed to hold its breath. Then the manager reached for an old internal file, one kept far from the front desks and daily transactions, and said the man's last name with a respect that sounded less like recognition and more like memory. The manager opened the file slowly, with the care people use when they know they are handling more than paper. Inside were copies of documents, old signatures, internal notes from years most of the current staff would barely remember. The older man watched in silence, his face unreadable, while the manager turned each page with growing certainty. "I haven't seen this name in a very long time," the manager said at last. His voice had lost the polished confidence he used downstairs with clients. Now it carried something rarer, respect mixed with caution. "Most of the people who knew this history are retired. Some are gone." The old man nodded, as if that was exactly what he expected to hear. The manager looked again at the envelope, then at the man seated across from him. "You could have called ahead." "I wanted to come in myself," the older man said. "I wanted to see the place as it is now." That answer settled heavily in the room, not because it was dramatic, but because it meant something. He hadn't come for convenience. He had come to witness, to measure what time had changed, and perhaps what it hadn't. The manager leaned back, exhaled quietly, and closed the folder halfway. "They didn't recognize you downstairs," he said carefully. A faint, almost weary smile touched the old man's face. "No," he replied, "but that's not the part that surprised me." That was when the manager stopped speaking altogether, because suddenly the visit no longer felt like a routine matter of records or signatures. It felt like an evaluation. The manager folded his hands on the desk, but even that small movement carried tension now. He was no longer speaking to a surprise visitor. He was speaking to someone whose opinion might matter far more than anyone downstairs yet realized. For the first time since the older man arrived, the silence between them felt less polite and more serious. "You said you wanted to see the place as it is now," the manager began. "I hope what happened in the lobby won't leave the wrong impression." The older man looked toward the window for a moment, watching the faint reflection of the bank's name in the glass. "It already left an impression," he said. "Just not the one you think." The manager said nothing. "I wasn't watching to see whether people recognized my name," the man continued. "Names fade. Time does that. I was watching to see whether this place still recognized certain values." That sentence seemed to land harder than anything else he had said. Downstairs, employees had seen an old coat, slow steps, a quiet voice. But upstairs, the manager was beginning to understand what the visit really meant. This wasn't about nostalgia. It wasn't about paperwork alone. It was about what the bank had become, and whether the people running it still understood the kind of trust it had once been built on. The manager straightened in his chair. "You came to evaluate us," he said carefully. The older man met his eyes at last. "I came," he answered, "to see whether what was founded with dignity is still being carried with dignity now." The manager stood up and walked to the wall behind his desk, where several framed photographs marked the bank's earliest years. He hesitated only a second before lifting one of them down. It was old, slightly faded, taken on the day the branch first opened. 3 men stood in front of the building in dark suits, their faces younger, harder, full of purpose. The manager brought the frame back to the desk and placed it gently beside the folder. One of the men in the photograph was the older man sitting across from him. Not older, not slow, not overlooked. Young, sharp-eyed, upright. The kind of man who looked as if he had built things by hand and protected them with principle. "My grandfather used to talk about you," the manager said quietly. "He said this bank survived its hardest years because one partner refused to let it become the kind of place that measured people by appearances." The older man lowered his gaze to the photo. For the first time, something softened in his expression. Not pride, not exactly. Something closer to grief. "We built it to serve people," he said, "not sort them." The manager swallowed hard. Everything downstairs looked different now. The front desk, the waiting chairs, the whispering staff, the careful smiles. They were no longer small details of a busy day. They were evidence. The older man had walked into the institution he helped build and been treated like he didn't belong there. And somehow that hurt more than if they had simply failed to recognize his face. The manager remained standing for a moment, the old photograph still between them, like a piece of living evidence. Whatever distance had existed when the meeting began was gone now. In its place was something heavier. The uncomfortable realization that the man sitting quietly across the desk had not just visited the bank. He had, in many ways, returned to it. "I'm sorry," the manager said at last, and this time the words sounded personal. The older man looked up, calm but unreadable. "For what?" he asked. The manager hesitated. "For the way you were received, for the assumptions, for the fact that no one thought to see beyond them." The old man studied him for a second, then rested one hand lightly on the folder. "This isn't about me being recognized," he said. "If respect only appears after a name, a title, or a photograph, then it isn't respect. It's fear of being wrong." The sentence cut deeper than any accusation could have. The manager lowered his eyes. Downstairs, what had seemed like harmless efficiency now looked like something else entirely. Impatience dressed as professionalism, judgment disguised as routine. And the worst part was how ordinary it had become. The older man rose slowly from his chair and glanced once more at the photograph. "A bank earns trust one person at a time," he said. "It loses it the same way." Then he turned toward the door. When the office door opened, the manager didn't walk ahead of the older man this time. He walked beside him. That alone was enough to change the air downstairs before either of them reached the last step. Conversation softened. Keyboards slowed. The same employees who had barely spared the old man a glance now looked up all at once, instinctively sensing that whatever they had assumed earlier had been disastrously incomplete. The manager kept one hand lightly near the railing, not to guide the man as if he were fragile, but to honor him as if his presence mattered. And now, in full view of the lobby, it clearly did. By the time they reached the main floor, the receptionist had already straightened her posture. The teller who had looked past him before now couldn't seem to meet his eyes for more than a second. Even the security guard, who had once watched him with suspicion, stepped aside with quiet embarrassment and opened the path without being asked. But the older man didn't pause to enjoy the shift. He didn't look around for apologies. He simply took in the room the same way he had from the beginning, carefully, calmly, as if he were reading not faces, but values. Then the manager turned toward the staff and said, with deliberate clarity, "I'd like everyone to understand who this gentleman is." The entire lobby went still. And for the first time that morning, the employees weren't waiting for the next customer, the next form, or the next number to be called. They were waiting for the truth. The manager let the silence settle before he spoke. No one moved. Even the usual sounds of the lobby, the rustle of papers, the tapping of keys, the quiet shifting of feet, seemed to fall away. "This gentleman," the manager said, his voice steady and clear, "is one of the founding partners of this branch." For a second, the words didn't seem to register. They just hung there in the air, too large for anyone to respond to immediately. Then the meaning landed. The receptionist's face drained of color. The teller who had dismissed him lowered her eyes at once. One customer in the waiting area turned to look again, this time not with curiosity, but with something closer to disbelief. The security guard stood completely still, his expression tightening as memory replayed the way he had watched the old man when he first entered. The manager continued. "Long before most of us ever worked here, he helped build this place, its standards, its reputation, and the principles it was meant to stand for." No one spoke. The older man remained calm through all of it. He didn't step forward. He didn't correct anyone. He didn't wear the reveal like a weapon. If anything, that made the moment harder to bear. Because the room now understood something painful. The respect he was receiving should not have depended on who he used to be. And in that silence, each employee was left alone with the same realization. He had not changed since walking in. Only their vision of him had. No one rushed to explain themselves. That was the strangest part. In most moments of embarrassment, people reach for excuses. They blame confusion, timing, procedure, misunderstanding. But here, in the heavy stillness of the lobby, excuses would have sounded smaller than the truth. Every employee in the room knew exactly what had happened. They had seen an older man in a worn coat, standing quietly by the counter, and decided what he was worth before he had said more than a few words. The receptionist finally opened her mouth as if to apologize, then stopped. The teller's hands hovered over her keyboard without touching it. A customer near the waiting chairs looked from one face to another, recognizing that he had just witnessed something far more uncomfortable than a simple mistake. He had watched people reveal their values in real time. The older man let the silence remain for a moment longer, Then he spoke, not loudly, but with the kind of calm that carries to every corner of a room. "I did not come here to embarrass anyone," he said. "And I did not come here to be honored for something I did many years ago." He looked around the lobby, meeting faces one by one. "I came because institutions change slowly, not all at once. They change in habits, in tone, in what they reward, in how they treat the person who seems least important in the room." No one looked away now. "And when that changes," he said, "everything else follows." The words stayed in the room long after he finished speaking. No one interrupted them. No one tried to soften them. They were too precise for that. The receptionist thought of the careful tone she had used earlier, the kind that sounded polite on the surface, but carried dismissal underneath. The teller remembered how quickly she had looked past him, already searching for someone who seemed more urgent, more profitable, more worth her attention. Even the security guard, standing silently near the entrance, could feel the weight of his first suspicion pressing harder, now that he understood what it had revealed about him. The manager turned slightly toward his staff, but he didn't rescue them from the moment. He knew that would only make it easier to forget. Some lessons had to remain uncomfortable long enough to leave a mark. The older man rested his hand on the back of a chair, not because he needed support, but because he was in no hurry to leave. "Respect is tested in ordinary moments," he said. "Not when the room knows who is watching, not when a title is announced, and not when people are afraid of being ashamed afterward." Several employees lowered their eyes. "It is tested in the first glance," he continued, "the first tone of voice, the first assumption. That is where the truth lives." The lobby was silent again, but now it was no longer the silence of routine. It was the silence of people recognizing themselves more clearly than they wanted to. The manager drew a slow breath and stepped forward, no longer speaking as the man in charge of a branch, but as someone willing to be corrected in front of his own staff. "He's right," he said. The words were simple, but they changed the room again. This time, not with shock, with surrender. Not humiliation for its own sake, but the surrender that comes when truth is too clear to resist. "We talk often about service, professionalism, and standards," the manager continued. "But none of those things mean anything if they disappear the moment someone walks in looking ordinary, tired, or easy to overlook." No one moved. The employees listened the way people listen when they know the message is no longer abstract. The older man remained still, giving the manager space to finish. "We cannot call this a small mistake," the manager said, "because small mistakes repeated every day become culture. And culture is what people feel long before they read it on a wall or hear it in a meeting." That seemed to strike everyone more deeply than an apology alone could have. Then the manager turned to the older man and said, with quiet sincerity, "You came here to see what this place had become. I believe you have seen enough to know we still have work to do." The old man held his gaze for a moment, then gave the slightest nod. Not approval. Not yet. But perhaps permission to keep going. For a moment, the older man said nothing. He seemed to be measuring the room again, not for guilt this time, but for sincerity. There was a difference, and everyone could feel it. Then the manager turned fully toward his staff. "No one returns to business as usual after this," he said. His voice was calm, but there was no softness in it now. "Not today. Not tomorrow. We will review how we greet people, how we assess needs, how quickly we make assumptions, and how easily we confuse efficiency with dignity. Because what happened here was not a failure of policy. It was a failure of character. The words landed hard. The receptionist swallowed and straightened, no longer out of fear of being seen, but because she understood she had been seen clearly. The teller finally stepped away from her station, as if remaining behind the counter would now feel like hiding. Even the security guard lowered his head once, a quiet acknowledgement that he had played his part in the same pattern. The older man looked at them one by one. "A good institution is not proven by how it treats its most powerful visitor," he said. "It is proven by how it treats the person no one thinks matters." This time, no one in the room mistook his meaning. And for the first time that morning, the bank did not feel like a place protected by polished counters, procedures, or titles. It felt exposed, perhaps painfully, but honestly, to the standard it had once claimed to represent. For several long seconds, no one seemed to know what to do next. Then, the receptionist stepped forward. Her movement was hesitant, almost fragile, as if she understood that one wrong word would make the moment smaller instead of better. She stopped a respectful distance from the older man and folded her hands in front of her. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Not because of who you are, because of how I treated you before I knew." The older man studied her face for a moment. There was no performance in it now, no polished customer service tone, no safe script to hide behind. Just discomfort, honesty, and the first signs of understanding. "That matters more," he said. The receptionist blinked, as if she hadn't expected kindness to sound so steady. "I thought I was being efficient," she admitted. "I didn't realize how quickly that can turn into something cold." The old man gave a slight nod. "Most people don't realize it at first," he said. "That's why it becomes habit." Behind her, the teller looked shaken, in a different way now, not by exposure, but by recognition. The guard near the entrance stood straighter, not out of authority, but out of self-awareness. And the manager, still silent, seemed to understand that this was the real beginning of change, not the reveal, not the shame, but the moment someone chose to see clearly and speak truthfully. The older man adjusted his coat, glanced once around the lobby, and prepared to leave. The older man picked up the envelope, smoothed one corner of his coat, and turned toward the entrance. No one tried to stop him. No one rushed to fill the silence. The room seemed to understand that this moment did not belong to interruption. It belonged to reflection. As he began walking across the lobby, the same floor that had welcomed him with indifference now seemed to part for him without a word. The receptionist stepped back gently. The teller moved aside from the counter. The guard opened the door before the older man reached it, this time not out of suspicion or duty, but with quiet respect. Still, the older man never changed his pace. He did not slow down to absorb their apologies, and he did not speed up to escape the weight of the moment. He walked with the same measured calm he had carried from the second he entered, as if the lesson had never been about proving who he was, only about revealing who everyone else had been. At the door, he paused just once. He looked back, not dramatically, not with bitterness, but with the tired clarity of someone who had seen institutions rise, drift, and sometimes forget themselves. His eyes rested for a moment on the staff, then on the manager, and in that final glance there was no triumph, only expectation. The manager understood it immediately. This had not been the end of a story. It had been the beginning of a responsibility. Then the older man stepped outside, and the door closed softly behind him. For several seconds after the door closed, no one in the bank moved at all. The lobby remained exactly as it had been a few moments earlier. The counters, the waiting chairs, the glowing screens, the neat stacks of forms, but nothing felt the same inside it. The space had not changed. The people had. Or at least, they could no longer pretend they hadn't just seen themselves clearly. The manager was the first to shift. He didn't speak right away. He looked toward the entrance where the older man had disappeared, then slowly turned back to the staff. What he saw on their faces was not panic anymore. It was something quieter and in some ways more difficult to carry. Recognition. The receptionist lowered herself back behind her desk, but she did not reach for her keyboard. The teller stood with her hands resting at her sides, staring at the counter where the man had first placed his hand so patiently. Even the guard near the door seemed less certain of the posture he had worn all morning, as if authority, without humility, now felt incomplete. Finally, the manager spoke. "Remember this feeling," he said. No one answered. "Not because I want you to feel ashamed forever, but because comfort is how these things return. If this becomes just an uncomfortable story by tomorrow, then we will have learned nothing." His voice was low, controlled, and impossible to dismiss. Around the room, people straightened, not out of fear this time, but because something in them had shifted. And in the quiet that followed, the bank began, almost imperceptibly, to feel less like a machine and more like a place being forced to remember what it was supposed to be. The manager walked slowly to the center of the lobby, as if even the familiar floor beneath his shoes carried a different meaning now. He looked from one employee to the next and made no effort to soften what had happened. "This was never about failing to recognize a founder," he said. "That is only the detail that made it unforgettable. The real failure happened much earlier, when we decided what kind of man he was before we gave him the dignity of being fully seen." The words settled heavily over the counters and waiting chairs. "If respect depends on importance," he continued, "then it is not respect at all. It is calculation. And the moment service becomes calculation, trust begins to die." No one in the room seemed able to escape the truth of that. The receptionist lifted her eyes first, not defensively, not to seek rescue, only to show that she was listening now in a different way. The teller gave a small, almost ashamed nod, as if recognizing that she had measured urgency and value by appearances so often it no longer felt like a choice. Even the guard near the entrance stood with a new stillness, one that looked less like control and more like thought. The manager drew a breath. "From this day forward," he said, "we do not wait for a title, a history, or a photograph to remind us how to treat people." And for the first time since the older man had walked in, the bank felt as though it might actually remember. As if on cue, the front door opened again. A woman stepped inside carrying a worn canvas bag, her shoulders tense, her attention split between a stack of papers in her hand and the child standing close beside her. She looked tired, uncertain, already bracing herself for delay before she had even reached the counter. Only minutes earlier, the room might have read her the same careless way. Another slow transaction, another complicated request, another person easy to sort before listening. But not now. The receptionist rose first, not with the polished smile of routine, but with real presence. "Good morning," she said gently. Take your time. We'll help you. The teller stepped out from behind the counter instead of waiting from a distance. The guard moved the nearest chair aside to make space for the child without being asked. No one hurried the woman. No one looked past her. No one tried to guess her problem before hearing her words. The manager watched all of it in silence. It was a small moment, ordinary, almost invisible, and yet it carried more meaning than any speech he could have given. Because this, he realized, was where the bank's future would actually be decided, not in framed values, not in polished language, not in private offices upstairs, but in these first few seconds when someone walked in, hoping not to be dismissed. For the first time that morning, the change in the room felt real. Outside, the older man disappeared into the flow of the street as quietly as he had entered the bank that morning. No crowd followed him. No one called his name. Within moments, he was just another figure moving through the city, easy to overlook, easy to underestimate, easy to forget if you had learned nothing at all. But inside the bank, no one would forget. Not the receptionist who had mistaken politeness for respect, not the teller who had measured importance before listening, not the guard who had watched first and understood later, and not the manager who now knew that a branch could lose its values long before it lost its profits. The old man had not demanded recognition. He had demanded something harder, integrity, when no one seemed important enough to deserve it. And that was the lesson left behind in the quiet after he was gone. That dignity is not something earned by status, restored by titles, or proven by history. It is something revealed in the very first moment when one human being decides how to see another. Because in the end, the man never changed. Only the way they looked at him did.